The whip cracked through the hot Louisiana air, but this time, it never landed. On August 15, 1857, an enslaved woman did the unthinkable. She caught the whip in her bare hands and turned it against the man who had owned her for 7 brutal years. Her name was Elsa Marie Dubois, and her defiance would become a story that haunted slave owners and inspired generations. But let me ask you, if every day of your life meant pain, humiliation, and fear, would you stay silent and survive, or risk everything to fight back, even if it meant certain death? And before we dive deeper, tell me in the comments, where in the world are you watching this from right now? Because what happens next is a story you won't forget. Magnolia Grove was a place of wealth for its owners, but of torment for the enslaved people who worked its fields. The air hung heavy with humidity, mixed with the scent of magnolia blossoms and sweat. But no sweet fragrance could hide the truth. This was a place built on suffering. Elsa had been sold to Charles Beauregard in 1850 for $800. She was only 17 at the time. By 24, she had endured 7 years of his cruelty. Charles was a man who broke people not just with the whip, but with fear. Other women before Elsa had either died, disappeared, or wasted away under his hand. But Elsa was different. She carried herself with a dignity he couldn't crush. No matter how hard he tried, she refused to bow her head. That quiet strength infuriated him, and it inspired the other slaves. They saw how she secretly tended wounds, how she guided runaways into the swamps, how she refused to give in when summoned for special duties. Elsa's defiance was not loud, but it burned like a hidden fire. On that August morning, Beauregard discovered Elsa teaching slave children to read from torn pages of an old Bible. In Louisiana, that was a crime. Education meant hope, and hope was dangerous. Furious, he fetched his favorite tool of punishment, a braided whip studded with bits of metal, a weapon that had tasted blood many times. But when he raised it against Elsa, something happened he never expected. She didn't flinch, she didn't beg. She looked straight into his eyes, and when the whip cracked forward, Elsa caught it. In that instant, everything changed. The instrument of terror became a weapon of resistance. Beauregard lunged, screaming words his slaves had heard 1,000 times before. But Elsa was faster. With the precision of someone who had felt that whip too many times, she wrapped it around his throat. Witnesses later said his strangled gasp was unlike any sound they'd ever heard. Half whistle, half prayer. Elsa whispered names as she pulled tighter. Names of the women who had died before her. Sarah, Marie, Catherine, Josephine. Each name gave her strength. Every lash she'd endured, every night she'd been forced into silence, all of it poured into her arms as she pulled the whip tighter around her master's neck. Beauregard collapsed, his fingernails tearing at his own throat in a desperate attempt to breathe. But it was too late. For the first time in Magnolia Grove's history, the master lay dead at the hands of someone he thought he owned. But Elsa's act did not happen in secret. Watching through the cabin window was Edmund Beauregard, Charles's nephew. Fresh from law school in New Orleans, he had come expecting business. Instead, he saw his uncle strangled by the woman he called property. What Edmund saw shook him to the core. He expected Elsa to flee into the swamp, but instead, she knelt beside her dead master and closed his eyes with a gentleness that shattered his world. How could someone society called property show more humanity than the man who owned her? Elsa then walked out of the cabin into the blazing Louisiana sun. She raised her voice so that everyone could hear, "Master Charles is dead. I killed him with his own whip." The plantation froze. Slaves stopped working. Overseers dropped their tools. Even the birds fell silent. It was more than a confession. It was a declaration of war. She was telling everyone, slaves and masters alike, that resistance was possible. And that truth terrified the white men more than her act itself. The plantation bell rang in panic, calling overseers and neighbors. Within hours, more than 40 white men surrounded the cabin. They came armed with muskets, torches, and rope. But Elsa did not run. She stayed inside with her master's pistol and his ledger, waiting. She even used the time to write, on scraps of paper with charcoal, the names of slaves who had died under Charles's cruelty. Next to each name, she wrote a single word, remembered. By evening, Sheriff William Landry arrived. The mob wanted a lynching. He wanted a trial. But even he knew the trial would only be a formality. The law demanded execution. As the sun set, Elsa walked out to face her accusers. In one hand, she held Charles's leather ledger, listing the prices he had paid for human lives. In the other, her own writings, the stories of the women who had died. She read the names aloud, along with the prices Charles had paid for them. The crowd of white men, who understood slavery only as business, fell silent hearing the cold economics of their world spoken by one they called property. When accused of lying, Elsa's response was simple. I killed a man who thought money gave him the right to our bodies. If that makes me a murderer, then every master in Louisiana is guilty of the same crime. Her words echoed louder than the mob's shouts. Even as they dragged her to the hanging tree, Elsa declared, "Kill me if you must. But know this, my death will not end with me. We remember every cruelty, every kindness, and one day, someone will remember my name." At 9:47 that night, the rope tightened around Elsa's neck. Her body swayed in the humid Louisiana night. But her story was only beginning. By morning, whispers of her defiance had spread across parishes. Songs were sung in the fields, songs that seemed harmless to overseers, but carried coded messages about Elsa. Her name became a secret password for escape. Runaways said they were going to see Elsa. Slave mothers told their children bedtime stories of the woman who fought back. Even Confederate reports noted the danger. They banned the use of her name in slave quarters, calling it a threat to order. And when Union soldiers marched into Louisiana years later, they found former slaves who still spoke of Elsa like she was alive. Some wore rope bracelets as a sign of defiance, remembering the woman who had turned a whip into a weapon and a noose into a symbol. Elsa's story survived in whispers, in songs, in oral histories. A century later, during the Civil Rights Movement, her name resurfaced in speeches and marches. She was no longer just a victim. She was a symbol of courage, of choosing dignity even in the face of death. Her story reminds us that sometimes one act of resistance, even when it costs everything, can echo through generations. So when we speak the name Elsa Marie Dubois, we don't just remember a slave who strangled her master. We remember a woman who chose freedom over fear, and who proved that even in the darkest times, one spark of defiance can light a fire that refuses to die. If you found Elsa's story powerful, let me know where you're watching from. And if you want more hidden stories like this, don't forget to subscribe, because history is full of people whose courage still shapes our world today.